Hi everyone, this is Abby. I am a light-skinned East Asian femme and I have long dark hair with a dark top on, and I'm sitting in a room that's light gray on camera. I think it's supposed to be blue, with colorful books behind me and a white bookcase and a screen print of whales to my left. And today I'm calling from the unceded and stolen territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Coquite, Stalo, and Coquitlam nations known as so-called Port
Thanks, Abby. Hi, everyone. My name is Bhupie. I am a light-skinned South Asian fat woman. I have pink and blackish curly wavy hair. I just realized we're all wearing black tops today, which is
Mm.
a whole other thing. But I'm wearing a black top. I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf covered with mostly plants and a couch, and then a bookshelf with some books and some more plants. Today, I'm calling from the stolen, unceded ancestral territories of the Coquitlam, Coquite, Samiamu, Katsi, Kwantlen, Tsawwassen nations, which is in so-called Surrey, BC, Canada. And today we have actually Vikki. I'm really excited about this conversation, Vikki, for a variety of reasons, and we'll jump into those pieces, but we'll let you introduce yourself. And yeah, I'm really excited. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks for that. I'm Vikki Reynolds. I'm a white-skinned person. My people are from Ireland and England. I have blotchy white skin. I have hair that looks like I have highlights, but it's actually just different colors of gray. I am also wearing black, but I have a scarlet scarf because my sister told me now that I'm turning gray and I don't wear makeup, I should do some color thing. And I'm standing in my office as well, and there's just a bunch of political posters behind me saying resist, struggle, and love together. That's pretty cool. We'll go with that. I'm on the territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people in what's understood as Vancouver and what's understood as British Columbia.
Thanks, Vikki. I know Abby and I have done some introductions about ourselves, and I actually want to make public the fact that we both have a relationship with you. And we actually met each other because of you. You introduced us to each
Oh,
other. So this is cool. And you've played, I think, a role as a supervisor for the both of us and colleagues at times and mentor at times. This is really cool to have you here join us in this way. So welcome and thank you. And maybe we can do a little introduction about yourself in whatever way feels good to you.
sure. Thanks for that. First of all, I just want to speak to our relationships. I just have big revolutionary love for the both of you. I do remember that I introduced you two together. But what I remember is I was just shocked in my head that you didn't already hang together. When you build your solidarity teams, oh, these two giants of the movement. And then I was like, oh yeah, they haven't met yet. So that was like an honor to do that. And it's what I really appreciate is the multiplicity and the fluidity from queer theory of our relationships. That Abby, I was your prof in your
Mhm.
master's, right? And Bhupie, I think I met you when I hired you to be a clinical therapist, where I was the supervisor and stuff. So we met in these really formal structures that were pretty oppressive. And I just honored both of your resistance to all kinds of things that weren't okay and in all kinds of places that you were working and stuff. And just that our relationship is fluid and that that we've laterally mentored each other. Like Abby and I worked together in an abolitionist group and you've brought great new teachings to me. It's just wonderful to know each other across time. And Bhupie, you've been part of my supervisory solidarity team since forever. So I really appreciate that. I'm Vikki Reynolds and I have a PhD in psychology, and I need to name that because it's just amplifies my voice and it's such a site of privilege. I often flippantly say, but I mean it, that a PhD in psychology is like a doctorate in arrogance, meaning that I have 27 years of school where I've been taught to start to look at people for how they're broken, to make an assessment, and then make a formal diagnosis and then a treatment plan, which is telling people how to live, which for me lines up with paternalism, which is from patriarchy. And I want to side with autonomy, which is trusting people with their own lives. So I do have a lot of education, but it's been strategic and useful, like in the academy, Abby, and to amplify a voice that's talking about direct action activism informed. So I think my life work, I identify more as a social justice activist and from community movements and an organizer. Um, my life work has been moving what we know from social justice movements into the stuff that gets called therapy. And of particular importance for today's conversation is the work that I've been invited into by like very generous human beings who've survived political violence and torture. I'm talking about refugees and asylum seekers from around the world. Today, I'm primarily going to talk about the influences from Latin America on me, but also survivors of political violence and torture who are Indigenous in this country, who are suffering political violence and torture at the hands of the Canadian government and the Canadian state, and how, as a white settler, I benefit from that. A lot of my work is on the stuff that gets called trauma, which is a word I do not like. Trauma has replaced oppression and violence and harm and political harm and the social context of that work. I believe I'm responding to human suffering and that the work is inherently political, and that neutrality is not a possibility. And I've also worked at rape crisis centers and with the stuff that gets called addiction and clinically supervising the transgender-free clinic and with the queer community. But for me, all that work is the same work. And I came to this from activism on death row in the United States, which was unpaid, just activism for me. And I wasn't, quote, a therapist yet, but all of that political violence and structured state violence and torture of people, that's been the heart of my work. That's what and I talk about my work as a supervision of solidarity, and I look for solidarity teams. And I need to say, I know that you never create anything by yourself. Everything I'm going to bring has been co-created by communities of struggle and on their back, not just by therapists and clients, but communities of struggle, targeted communities that I've been a part of and that I've been invited to act in solidarity with. So those are my real references for this.
Thanks, Vikki, for such a beautiful introduction of like where you're coming from and what's brought you here to this work in this way. And I think one of the things that I'm having a reflection on is often folks will quote you or other people as people who are doing this work. Not saying that you're not doing the work, but that you've been informed by a whole bunch of other people and communities, and that doesn't get named often.
No.
And I think what I'm really excited about is this conversation is about really looking at the lineages from which you've learned from and the knowledges that like are existing and have existed for some time that don't get named. I'm like, and this is like the foundational framework for what we're all trying to do here in what we call therapy. And so I don't know, Vikki, if there's like a place you wanted to start today, because you wanted to lay like a history of liberatory practice, or I think you said like activist orientations. And yeah, so I don't know where you feel like you want to begin today.
Oh, thanks for that. I really appreciate what you said about how I get referenced. And it ends with that. And that's what white supremacist academia does. As soon as you got an academic reference, it's the end of inquiry. And when I think about the struggle I had doing my PhD, for example, I referenced Indigenous knowledges. The date was time immemorial. The speakers were belongs to the nation. And universities have a really hard time with that kind of referencing. Anything else is the appropriation of knowledge and the erasure of where these knowledges come from. And I feel energy going through my body as we're talking about that. So I'm also aware that I'm someone who benefits from those white supremacist referencing acts that end inquiry. Yeah. And like you're saying, it's not that I haven't done some things that are useful. I think I have done some things that are useful, but I sure as heck haven't done them alone. And they didn't start with, I have this great idea in 1999. I have this great idea.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really important for us to be able to name and recognize. And I think that's a big part of what's informed my work with you in a lot of ways too, is that like knowing that what you're speaking about is coming from a lineage of understanding and knowledge. And in particular for me, the connections were around like liberation psychology, or what we call liberation psychology. And after meeting with you and connecting with you, looking more into it and understanding a little bit more of having the language for what we're talking about in these other ways too. So I just want to name that piece too.
Thanks. When I did my master's, I just remember this teaching. I got it a bunch of times, which said, don't talk about politics and don't talk about religion, which meant don't unmask power. And there's no room for the sacred or love, right? 27 years of school and no professor mentioned love, unless they were talking about women who love too much or women who can't tell love from abuse. And why I mention that is just key for me is love and addressing power and oppression. And that's what liberatory psychology is about. So everything I wasn't allowed to talk about in my academic training, and certainly was absent, I didn't learn any of this from my academic training either, is what's at the heart of it. For me, when I think about liberatory psychology, I think about Ignacio Martín Baró. Ignacio Martin Baró was from Spain, and he was a Jesuit priest. I was brought up Catholic and also have huge critiques of the Catholic Church and have left it, but wanted to keep the sacred practice of it. Ignacio Martin Baró, as a Jesuit, was also a psychiatrist, a psychologist. And he was in El Salvador in Latin America during the dirty wars of the 1980s, the wars of empire from the United States. He was actually assassinated in 1989 by a Salvadoran death squad that was funded and trained by the United States, by the School of the Americas, which is the school for torture, right? I didn't know that Ignacio Martin Baró was a Jesuit priest. I didn't find that out till later. In fact, when he was murdered, I wasn't a therapist. I was living in San Francisco, and I went to a protest because not just Ignacio Martin Baró was assassinated, he was assassinated with 6 Jesuit brothers and their housekeeper and her daughter. And when this is remembered, people often say that Ignacio Martin Baró was assassinated. He would be devastated if we didn't name the daughter of the housekeeper and his brothers that were murdered at the same time. Although the death squad was after him, and why they were after him, Abby and Bhupie, is because he was talking about liberation and liberation psychology. And what he was talking about how theory and practice have to be centered on people who are excluded, on the people who are oppressed. And he had really rich critiques of psychology, of the Eurocentric psychology. And he actually said, in order for psychology to be liberated, we first have to liberate psychology. And what we need to liberate it from is white supremacy and complicity in violent struggles and death and oppression of all these kind of people. One thing that he's talking about, we need to center therapy. The project of therapy is to do something about what Mbembe calls necropolitics and what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls structural and targeted abandonment. So Mbembe's ideas of necropolitics are policies that actually kill people. Like where he was in Latin America, in El Salvador, there were policies by the government and death squads that were literally killing people. And the structural and targeted abandonment of people that abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about is people people whose lives are so precarious. What Judith Butler would say is ungrievable lives that were never allowed to live, right? Queer theorist Judith Butler would talk about it like that. So what's interesting is what Baró said is that psychology has absolutely failed because it has not addressed the problem of the time, which is not depression or anxiety or personality disorder. It's the murder of people and the structural oppression of them, and that those targeted communities. I became connected with Ignacio Martin Baró as a therapist a couple of years after I was protesting his death, because I was protesting death squads and I was protesting the United States imperialist powers. I was just as an activist. And then later, I became the clinical supervisor at the Center for Survivors of Torture, and an El Salvadorian therapist who was a refugee came and he gave me Ignacio Martin Baró's book, Writings for Liberatory Psychology. And I put it all together. I'm like, oh my God, I protested his execution and he's a Jesuit priest. This was all, you know how these things happen. So that's how I found a voice for that, and that's how I find Ignacio Martin Baró. He would tell you none of these ideas are his. Yeah. But Abby, you can see the connection to abolitionist movement, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you intertwine with all the examples of how these theories are all speaking to the same thing, but in different ways, and also drawing on the collectively held knowledge that there's pieces that we're just building together.
So what it's standing on, what liberation's standing on, is really Marxism, a class analysis, and a feminism that's actually an intersectional and anti-racist feminism. Those things are key, as well as decolonial thought. And when he was writing in the 1970s, and he was already talking about decolonization. We weren't hearing about that in the white world, and certainly psychology wasn't willing to talk about that. Colonial powers weren't willing to talk about that. Ngugi wa Thiong'o in Tanzania was writing Decolonizing the Mind at the same time across the path, across the big water. And the other thing I just want to mention is, well, I'm going to talk about Ignacio Martin Baró because my connection is survivors of torture from Latin America and those struggles, that I'm in solidarity with those struggles. At the same time, these ideas were being picked up in South Africa and in the Philippines. You know, that these aren't, so we're not creating a new great white man theory, right? Which speaks to what you're saying. There's always threads.
I think I just want to also reflect on that piece that when we were talking about originally as well, often you get referenced or other therapists get referenced. And I think this is really important to kind of name that this is, to me, as you're speaking, it's ancestral wisdom knowledge that communities have known for a long time. And then we repackage it and sell it as something to buy or profit off of. And so I think, that's what I'm hearing as you're speaking about some of the places, all of the places this is coming from. And I'm imagining there's more that you're not aware of, that I'm not aware where they're coming.
What's interesting too is most of us have read Bell Hooks, but do you know Bell Hooks' work was really solidly informed by Paulo Freire, who was solidly informed by Ignacio Martin Barrow. Like all these ideas hang together. Black feminist Bell Hooks, who wrote Teaching to Transgress. That's my favorite Bell Hooks text, and most people haven't read it. But she was taking on pedagogy or teaching and the white supremacy of it and the commodification of knowledge. These ideas link back to Paulo Freire talking about pedagogy of the oppressed, right? And not thinking about teachers are the ones who know and students are empty vessels. That anybody who uses those metaphors, they're referencing Paulo Freire without referencing him. We think that's just a truism of Western education. It isn't. People fought to get that in there. Paulo Freire really mattered because he was talking about dialogue, right? And this is really core to my work. The idea, because I think about my work as witnessing work, right? Like from activism, that I'm not necessarily doing therapy with people. I'm doing like a political witnessing with people. That's my role. So Paulo Freire talked about dialogue as a dialogue is something, everybody uses this word dialogue. There's a lot of talk about dialogue in therapy, but Paulo Freire's writings on dialogue are really specific. He's saying we cannot be in a dialogue together if we're replicating oppression. So just think how many things frame themselves as dialogues that are not dialogical at all. And it is not enough for an oppressed person to be allowed to speak. I think about the city hall opening up the mics for homeless people and they're allowed to speak. And they've tripled the security and they took everybody's water bottles and phones. This is not a dialogue, right? But it's not enough to be allowed to speak. Your word must matter. And there must be an accountability to you from power. That's when you're actually in a dialogue, right? And you can see how this has informed Paulo Freire and Ignacio Martin Barrow, like how these ideas fit together, and Bell Hooks and so many other voices, that this is trying, when people talk about a therapeutic conversation, if you're going to talk about it as a dialogue, you have to do a lot of work to make sure there's no replication of oppression in there.
Can you speak a little bit to this piece of, I know we talk about this in this language, but what do you mean by witnessing?
Yeah, for me, witnessing has many histories, right? There's people you give a witness in court. That's problematic. That's carceral. There's witnessing in a religious way. And here, actually, I would tie it into the work of Makungu Akinyala, Black, brilliant therapist and professor from the United States. He talks about the soul wound that we can't, which fits exactly with what I'm saying about liberatory psychology and a thread from Ignacio Martin Barrow. But Makungu Akinyala talks in the United States that there is a soul wound of colonization and the genocide of indigenous people and the enslavement of Black people and building the economy on their backs, and that America has to solve, they have to address the soul wound. They, instead of doing like individual sessions with Black people about depression, that we need to address that. And he calls his work testimony work, Bhupie. And that's a kind of witnessing, right? Testimonies, because I can hear him say, can I have a witness? That's from testimony work. I wouldn't do that because it's cultural appropriation and not a fit. But that's a kind of witnessing that can really swim nicely with what I'm about. So when I talk about witnessing, I'm talking about it from activist traditions where we're called to witness. I just think about, for example, international movements of solidarity, like the movement in Iran late when the young woman was murdered by the morality police for not having her head covered. And there's been a movement, women, life. I want to say power, but I don't think it's love. Maybe it's love. The women, life, love movement that happened around the world. That's the international world. Let Iran know we're watching you. And we know you're killing women. We know this is femicide. We know this is beyond misogyny. There's something about the power of international witnessing that says we have our own issues. We got our own stuff going on, but we are watching you. And a hope to hold governments to account. Now, not just in a liberal sense of holding people like a carceral sense to international laws, but ethically, morally, relationally, we will call you to account, right? That's from witnessing. And for me, when I'm working with survivors of torture, when I started to work with survivors of torture over 30 years ago, I never approached my work as therapeutic, certainly definitely not as trauma therapy. What I was being framed of was doing trauma therapy. And I just think about that as putting a person in a room, diagnosing what's wrong with them and trying to do enough interventions to change that. That's definitely not what we're doing. I'm trying to act in solidarity with the person and create an ethical container that can actually name the political context. And this comes from Ignacio Martin Baró. So what Ignacio Martin Baró was talking about was how therapy, in particular psychotherapy, how it should be being like socially transformative. But what it has done is it actually attributes sociopolitical problems to the individual. And there has to be a critical examination of the social power and the structures. It's critical that it's not interpersonal people's problems, it's structural, right? And we've heard other people say the person's not the problem's a problem. But Ignacio Martin Baró would say the person's not the problems are structural, right? And they're massive and they're informing a lot more people. We resituate psychology. What Ignacio Martin Baró invited us to do is to resituate psychology as part of the problem, as a colonizing white supremacist tool that was being used in gaslighting in some ways, but structurally, if we think about things like mental health acts, where we actually incarcerate people, and how that's being weaponized against people who are suffering because of this structural oppression, right? Because of these ideas. What Ignacio Martin Baró was really concerned about too was the ideology of psychology, which is everything I'm saying. The idea that people are broken somewhere in their brains, that you have an id-ego, super ego, that you can go to therapy and do this. They have an unconscious, all of these kind of ideas, and how this is absolutely ideological, that people are broken and they must, quote, do their work to get better individually outside of social relationships. And like I said, it's interesting because Ignacio Martin Baró and Paulo Freire together engendered these other ways of looking at it. So they wouldn't have called their work witnessing, but what they were interested in, for example, were things like manifestations. That's a Latin American way to talk about protest, but protest that's a carnival where we're feeding people, taking care of the children, protesting, educating, not just a quote protest, but like a community, right? He also talked about that we are organizing ourselves into a future that is already present. We're organizing ourselves into a future that's already present. And isn't this reminiscent of Miriam Kaba and other Black abolitionists and people like Howard Zinn calling for world building, right? So when he's talking about this, manifestations would be one way to do therapy, that it's social, that the problems are social, not personal. So the responses have to be social. And that's witnessing is social. That's why I've always had problems with the language of confidentiality. I am a professional. I don't give my people's names out. I don't break their confidentiality, but we hide behind neutrality, objectivity, and confidentiality to never, what a witness has to do is you have an ethical obligation to speak truth to power, to do whatever you can with the power you have to change the social context in which horrors occur, right? I'm thinking about like the other thing that Ignacio Martin Baró and Paulo Freire inspired was Augusto Ball. And I don't know if Augusto Ball, but he created the theater of the oppressed. So the theater of the oppressed came from the pedagogy of the oppressed. And it was about manifestations that were theatrical, where people did social healing together, but they wouldn't have used the word healing. It's still a vibrant practice that still happens, right? Where people come together in manifestations and make meaning together around the social context that really resists them being seen as mentally ill and moving towards liberation, moving towards liberatory ways of being. That has absolutely informed. That's absolutely, I think, cornerstone to some of the stuff I do.
Can I pause you there for a moment? I feel like you've named a lot of things really quickly. So I'm just like, just wanting to create a bit of a pause there just for that piece, but also this important piece that you're talking about witnessing and naming, being able to contend with power and name it, and the ways that we're complicit in not doing that in therapy and the work we do. Because often what I'll hear people say is, I can't do any advocacy work, or I can't do any activism work in relation to my therapy work. And so it's almost as if it's like at odds, or you can't do that, or you can't, there's also these conversations, you can't bring the political into the room, which is also really problematic in a whole other way. But I think this is where, for some folks, they really struggle with, is like, how do you actually name the structures of power, not only in the therapy room, but outside? And I think what you're speaking to is, yes, confidentiality is important, but we also are required to do something else outside of the therapy room too.
Yeah, I'm confounded, Bhupie, as are you, as is Abby. How can you not? How can we not? How can we not? To do anything less is to side with a Eurocentric, pathologizing way of being that locates oppression inside the brains of people so they're somehow broken and individually responsible for their own suffering, because they didn't pick up and do the work, or they're not, or the trans theoretical model, they're just not ready to make change. They're ready to throw over their goddamn governments. Like, they're ready for change. They might not want to sit down in therapy with you. What I would say to that is, and as you can both speak to this eloquently too, I don't bring the politics into the room. They're there. They are there. If you're a straight white man with a wedding ring and you want to have everything be apolitical and not talk about stuff, you are just replicating a therapy of expertise and white supremacy and paternalism coming from the rule of the father. You're acting as a father figure to fix these poor things. And also the class privilege of that, like all of that's getting replicated and just not named. That's gaslighting. Right. Because then it just, again, then that person's seeing a single mom on welfare whose kid is of color and has been taken by the cops. And they're sitting there thinking, how come I can't run my life? Why don't I have a ring as nice as his? How come his is the only car in the parking lot and I'm in the bus? If you don't name those differences, people will make sense of those in the interior alone and in isolation. I think it's a really unethical thing to do, to not name the politics that are present. We're not bringing the politics. Power, the intersections of power are always there, right? And yeah, so I'm curious about how all of us do that. I think that's what you're trying to do with this community you're building, right? Yeah, I'm just wondering what you're thinking more on that.
Yeah, I'm also, Abby, if you want to jump in, please do. I know usually you're like, I like to take my time to think about that, but I'm also thinking a little bit about these pieces of how, from my understanding of liberation psychology as well, is this piece around how we maintain things being the same is not doing anything. In psychology in particular, like you've mentioned. And that means as therapists, we also have a responsibility. And if we aren't doing anything, there's a complicity that exists there. And to me, if I really have deep care and love for the folks that I'm working with and the communities that I'm working in, how could I not be moved to try to do something based on even the conversations alone that I'm having with folks?
But I'm thinking about the ways you've been trained up in the schools we've been in, and what the position you're taking, Bhupie, and the position you take, Abby, you're in protest. You are resisting unethical ways of being that we've been educated in, right? And if we go back, it hasn't always been like this. In the 1970s, Ignacio Martin Baró was talking about how psychology ignores the political and social context of people's behavior and makes sense of people's behaviors if it happens in their life as opposed to in the social world. And he said that actually psychology is an accomplice and an oppressor. It's an accomplice to the social injustices that are happening. He said psychology is not impartial. It's not apolitical. It is political, and it's culpable and needs to be held responsible. How do you hold psychology responsible to the harms that have been caused? That's a question he put that question out here decades ago, right? It's one of the reasons that he was silenced and murdered, is he was questioning everything, but he was getting listened to because he made so much sense, right? Ignacio Martin Baró said what everybody was experiencing because of the widespread political violence and torture in El Salvador. He said, nobody here is mentally ill. This is a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances. There's absolutely nobody here that's mentally ill. Now, we've heard that said by lots of people later, but taking it, see, my concern is decontextualizing what Ignacio Martin Baró said and what liberation theology said to get to something around people have normal responses to abnormal circumstances. But he's not saying that. He's saying when he says people, he means the people, not in a white supremacist way, right? He means the people of the land, the interconnectedness of people the people holding, as you would, standing on the shoulders of their ancestors in their political moment in history when he says the people, right? The people are not crazy. The people are responding appropriately to what's going on. So yeah, I just think about how fortunate I was that I was working with survivors of torture, and I had an El Salvadoran colleague who was a survivor of torture who articulated these ideas that we were like enacting with each other. And I got onto these ideas really early because so often, like when my work is referenced, it gets referenced to particular theoretical schools of therapy as if that's where it comes from. And that's never where it comes from. Some of the practices sound like some things. I'm not saying I wasn't trained up to be a therapist, I was, but it's the liberatory psychology, that worldview, and that witnessing can be a piece of our activism in terms of social change. That's actually what needs to get seen as the thread of my work, I think, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, instead of being depoliticized from all the origins of which that inform all of these things. And it makes me think about
Yeah.
what was it called? The Tyranny of Politeness. I think we read about that in L. Jones' book, Abolitionist Intimacies. And I think it speaks to how, as in psychology, we move towards pushing things under the rug too. But if we don't say it, if we don't name it, it's not there. This is like turning away from it and then calling it a day and then not, so that we don't have to be complicit or name that we're complicit in all these systems that we're perpetuating, because it's so much easier than to actually answer the question, how do we hold psychology accountable for all these things that we're witnessing all the time as therapists, regardless of whether or not you have this political lens? I believe that people have this kind of soul level understanding of what they're seeing, whether or not they're able to put words to it, right? And so it's just interesting to see how all of those things come together, and then looking at witnessing and transformative justice practices that I'm learning about now as well, of like, how do we, or even stop the sweeps in the downtown east side, like how do we come together as a community to witness and to provide those structural pieces of shifts as part of our work.
Like when I first moved to Vancouver 35 years ago, about 35 years ago, the police killed a homeless guy on the street. There wasn't that much structural homelessness at that time because the government was still funding social housing. There were a couple of homeless guys on Commercial Drive everybody knew, and the police killed one of these guys. They shot him to death because they said he had a knife. He's homeless, so he's got everything he owns on him. So of course he has a knife because he eats food. Anyway, they killed him. And what the response from the community was Cop Watch. They started Cop Watch. And it was just on the beginning of having cameras, that people could have cameras. Cameras were like a new technology then. And it was really interesting how Cop Watch, they started to say, film the police, watch the police, and witness the police. That was a fantastic action group, I would say, of witnessing that developed, and the sweet threads of that, like all over the place. But as you were speaking, Abby, I was thinking about Bhupie, something you said the other day about being a professor and teaching a course as a woman of color, and like I talked about the politics of politeness, trying to resist those politics of politeness, and the tyranny of politeness is better and different meaning. But how you, Bhupie, how you tried to create a space that you could name stuff in by saying, okay, I'm going to say it. All right, maybe that I think fits in here.
Yeah, no, I think it's like, again, how are we showing up in these different kinds of spaces to be able to name power and the systems of violence that are actually happening, right? I think also there was a connection that I was making with when you were talking about it, and this is a theme that's been showing up in some of these conversations, and it is the reason why we held the summit, is we have become so focused on interventions and modalities, and like even referencing these ideas to certain kinds of modalities, like, is so problematic because it takes away from where it's actually coming from and rooted in relationality and love and care for community and connection, right? So this is so what I guess I'm also saying is I would caution it to become like, so after listening to Vikki, I'm going to do this thing that's called witnessing as like an intervention that, and it becomes sold in that way as well, or packaged in that way as well.
Yeah, Ignacio Martin Barrow was really clear that liberation psychology was not a theory or a practice. It was a framework. And actually that's how I wrote up my PhD. When I talk about justice doing and solidarity work, I don't have, it's an ethical frame. How you do it is contextualized relationally with people, right? So the last thing he wanted was a commodification of this and the idea that anybody's going to do it right. And then thinking about that, the frame wasn't to do therapy with people. The frame was to actually transform society. That's what it was for. It had a much bigger goal. And thinking about the possibility of psychology being socially transformative, and and that for me brings in critical trans theorist Dean Spade is the one who wrote the book Mutual Aid. But a bunch of communities of struggle have always been doing mutual aid. And Dean's not pretending he made up that language, but those ideas of mutual aid, collective care, solidarity, that's the kind of organizing Burrow was talking about, how we're organizing ourselves into a future that's already present, right? But what is also interesting to me is the erasure and disappearance of these ideas that have always been present. I think one of the reasons I think it does matter that I was a prof, and Abby, I think you and I would agree to that, is that I did try to carve out some space to say some things that couldn't be said and to reference some people that weren't said. What I was thinking about, Bhupie, was you were saying, I got to let all these white people know I'm going to name white supremacy. So I'm going to name this thing. So you need to get yourself ready. You have to do all this work to be able to name white supremacy. But one of the things I think about is, before I was born, Frantz Fanon was talking about these very ideas in exactly this kind of language, right? Frantz Fanon was a Black psychiatrist from Martinique. And in the 1950s, he went to Algeria as a psychiatrist to deal with the psychological harms people were experiencing because Algeria was fighting for liberation from France. And the government of France and their agents, which would mean soldiers and other people who were there to torture people, they had widespread, what Frantz Fanon called political terrorism and widespread torture. And what he said was, this is not an individual psychological problem of people. This is a social problem. What Ignacio Martin Barrow said about torture in El Salvador was, this is social, meaning you harm one person in a family, in a society, you terrify 80 people, right? And that you can't take that one person, put them in a room with a therapist and make things better. We've got to come together with love, and we have to come back with connection, and we have to come back together with community and that ethic of belonging. There's all those things that we can be doing. So what was interesting for me was Frantz Fanon wrote a book called The Wretched of the Earth. And it's about what happened to Algerian people because of this widespread political state terrorism and torture by agents of the French government. And what he talked about is how psychology has always been a tool of colonization. He wrote that before I was born, you guys. And who's been talking, how I went to school for 27 years and I was asking questions. No professor ever referenced Frantz Fanon. And when I referenced him in papers, I was told it was not an academic reference because it was a published book. The Wretched of the Earth is not a peer-reviewed journal or anything, right? Who brought him forward, of course, for me was, again, Makungu Akinyele, who speaks extremely articulately about this in the testimony work that he does. But what Frantz Fanon said was that psychology is not just a white supremacist force, it's also colonizing. And he said we use this to look at the Algerian War and Algerians being tortured, how we're using these international measures like the DSM in this continent. I forget what it's called in the European context. We're looking at this text, this white supremacist text, to find out what's wrong with Algerians who are being tortured. And so everybody who's colonized is mentally ill. Same is true in the nation state that's called Canada, right? How convenient for white settler states that every Indigenous person can be given a diagnosis of trauma or intergenerational trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. Like, everyone's mentally ill who's Indigenous. They're all broken on the inside. It's just such a colonial tool. And we have that analysis, but Frantz Fanon wrote about that in like the 1950s. And that for me is not people, that's erasure. That's anti-Black racism in psychology and in the academy, to actually ignore him. And so what he said that I thought was so beautiful is, we shouldn't be using psychological tools to show what is mentally ill about the colonized, oppressed folks. If anything, we should look at it to see what's not mentally well about people who could do torture and genocide, right? And psychology's never been interested in that. Again, that's just another question that never got picked up. That was a big question that Frantz Fanon was asking, right? So I think these histories have really mattered in terms of bringing not just to politics, but an understanding that there's room for liberatory relationships with each other, which Paulo Freire would say is love. Revolutionary love is a commitment to others, a connection, a solidarity with their cause, and a commitment to each other. That's what love is, right? Yeah, for me, the erasure of love in all therapeutic work was like loud and clear in all of my trainings, right? And then you talk about professional boundaries and eroticism and sex and stuff. I mean, we're not talking about that, right? And one question you'll hear me ask often of people I'm supervising or teaching is, how is it possible you're doing any of your work in the absence of love? I do think that love is absent in a lot of what's passing for psychotherapy. And that concerns me. I'm just wondering I've just said a lot again, but I'm wondering what you're making of that.
Yeah, I guess I'm connecting it a little bit to some of the things that we've been taught up and trained up in psychology is, again, that requirement of neutrality, which erases any kind of level of like care and love and relationality that can exist, and the political being named, right? Like the political is always there, but it to be even named. And so I think there's a lot of unraveling we have to do as therapists to figure out, how do we show up with relationally? How do we show up with care and love? And what does that actually look like? And there's lots of examples of this in our lives every single day, where we aren't crossing, like we're not being violent towards other people in our relationships of love. And so it's getting me to think about, well, like, why? Obviously we know the why, but it's almost as if we don't know how to do this. And because we don't know how to do this, we have to have this blank slate kind of idea, lab coat, sterile version. But the other thing that I'm sitting with, Vikki, as you're talking about this, I think it's that question that keeps coming back of like, what do we have to do to actually change things where psychology becomes more about social change and less about continuing status quo and harming each other? We become complicit if all we do is individual therapy, where we're going, let's do this particular intervention and now you're okay and bye. We are very much complicit. And I guess I want to name that and say that, so that not only for us in this space together, but folks who are watching to think about that and hopefully be discomforted and not to think about, what does it look like to be in relationship with revolutionary love and invite something different?
Yeah, and I think actually Carl Tom, white guy, psychiatrist in Calgary, Carl Tom wrote a paper that caused a lot of trouble decades ago, maybe 3 decades ago now, talking about therapeutic loving and therapeutic violence. And just the idea that you could name something as therapeutic violence, nobody wanted to, no white people wanted to hear this. No professional people wanted to hear this. No people with privilege didn't want it. People who approached this work as individual psychotherapy did not want to hear this. And then there was a real schism at that time. I don't know if I pronounced that word right. A big break, as it were. And like a whole bunch of folks started to think about their work more as community work. That's where I went. It was like, yeah. And just thinking about as communities, when we come together, I just think of, when you were talking, I was thinking about what Howard Zinn said is, there are times people have behaved magnificently. Let's get really curious about that. And the doing of love. And so what I was also thinking about is about the time I was working with survivors of torture. And of course, I wasn't interested in trauma. I've always been interested in people's acts of resistance, because that comes from, of activism, that seeing I'm never interested in how people are mentally damaged by political violence or torture. I am interested in how people stayed human in situations outside of human understanding. I'm interested in how people were tethered to this planet by an ethic of belonging, which is always the doing of love. And at the same time, because I'm from a different era than you, Argentina was under military dictatorship, and many young people who were activists were murdered and disappeared. And disappeared means something particular, right? It means the state has murdered you. And the family says, no, we're not saying our son is dead or our daughter is dead. They're disappeared. And we're going to wait. We're going to hold the government accountable. We want their bodies or we want them back. And if you've murdered them, we want to hold you to account for that, right? And what they did is these were grandmothers of the disappeared, and they took pictures of their grandchildren, and some were mothers of the disappeared. They took pictures of their children and they stood outside of the dictator's palace where you were not allowed to gather. And they were standing in front, like I'm so moved, and I described, like, the first time I heard accounts of this before I ever saw pictures of this, but people were telling me about this, people who were coming from these struggles, that all of these grandmothers with pictures of their murdered grandchildren were standing in front of these lines of soldiers who were aiming rifles at them. That's the grandmothers of the disappeared, right? And the mothers of the disappeared. That is love, that kind of fierce love. And one of the women in an interview later said, "What are they going to do? Kill me? The worst has happened. You've killed my child." And I just feel so much energy going through my body. That is love, right? The love of my child is more important than my life and the safety of everybody else's children, right? It wasn't individual. They weren't trying to find their son. They were trying to have accountability and an end of the violence on that level. So I think about the love and the communalness and the solidarity and the moral courage and just the physical courage of standing there shook up my whole world, seeing that. And then, of course, once you see things like that, it's like when someone mentions a word to you and then you read it in the next book you read. Once somebody really explained that to me, I started to see it all over the place. And I could see how Indigenous communities here were struggling against state violence and erasure and murder of their young ones and trying to call account from the Canadian government and that's how, this is before people were telling stories of the residential schools in ways that were being listened to in any way. People were talking or not talking, Indigenous people, for their own reasons. But when they moved to witness, this was all about love and this wasn't about violence and anger. The violence and anger was on the colonial state side. This was about love and connection and a resistance against the erasure of folks, right? Which, of course, also the same time, right? I just came off of 10 years working on the death penalty, which is the erasure of humans. And as Judith Butler would say, ungrievable lives. These were monsters. We had to kill them. There's no way you can grieve that life. These threads really mattered in terms of who is worthy of love and our institutions telling us we shouldn't love anyway, but simultaneously telling us who not to love. It's pretty gaslighty, huh? I got tons of advice by professors who said, "We think you're smart. We think you have a real future. You got to drop the politics and there's a real place for you." And of course, you both know, I've built my reputation on my politics, just my ethics, which is an ethics of justice doing, right? That's the mythology of capitalism and hierarchy and patriarchy, that if you just toe the line, you're going to be better off somehow. That was really good advice. I resisted. So, yeah.
I'm just making some space, Abby, for you as well, because I know I jump in a little bit more quickly.
Please do jump in.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that I'm also thinking about is you've been really informed by activism in your work and bringing that in. And I think a lot of folks' trajectory to therapy is very different and haven't been informed in that way. I kind of wonder if I don't even know if I have a question. I'm just curious about what it's like for you working with a lot of therapists who may not have had that trajectory, and what are you inviting them to do or be curious about or invite them into?
Thanks for that question. I don't know that I can answer that question. I don't market myself, right? And you've both been in solidarity groups. I invite people that I know are sharing a collective ethic of justice doing so that we can struggle with each other, but we're not, ethical principles are never in conflict. We're never going to have someone say, "No, I'm not for dignity. I'm a bit more objective than that." We're not here to dignify people. We're here to fix their behaviors. So I think I let people know who I am, Bhupie. I'm pretty out about my politics, about my ethics. I've told you guys this, but like when I'm invited to keynote a conference, I always say, "You don't want me. I'm working class. I'm going to swear. I have a lot of tattoos and I'm going to name power." And a lot of people are going to be discomforted because nothing is as comfortable as white supremacy. People are like, "Oh no, we do want you." So one thing is I'm really careful where I go. I'm not trying to proselytize people into activism. But I do think that there's so many, actually, I guess mostly I connect with people who are being abandoned by formal supervision systems and psychology things, right? We found someone in activism told a worker to call me and they're working with incarcerated people who are basically being tortured. And so we fit them into our solidarity group because they didn't need therapy or supervision with me. They needed solidarity with other people. So that's how I gather folks, is through those threads of collective ethics. But when I'm like teaching or writing, I'm trying to invite people. One of the first questions I often ask when I am doing trainings or going into teams that are doing, first of all, I'm not working for like the police. I never worked for the police or family policing. So I'm very careful who I'm working with. But I'd be like with people working at overdose prevention sites or people working in rape crisis centers or transition homes or shelters or housing. When I go in there, I always ask folks the same question, which is, what is the heart of your work? Which is a love question. And I tell people about revolutionary love and I ask them, what's in your heart? Why are you here? And tell me, I don't need to know your degrees and I don't need to know what job titles and shit you have. I need to know what is in your heart. What are your commitments? What are your ethics? What are your values? What do we hold collectively? And I think those dialogues create some space for people to think that they are actually welcome here. I do think it's made sense that I've published a whole bunch because I've had so much feedback over decades of people saying, when I read this, I realized I could be out as an activist in my work. You know, and I'm not saying I'm the only one who did that, but I do know that I've done that for some people who've read my stuff. Boop, I don't think I'm answering your question.
No, you definitely are. That is exactly what I was curious about. Is I think for myself as well, one of the things that I think about in my work, in whatever role I'm in, is what is the heart of the work, like you're saying? What is the heart of the work?
Yep.
What are the ethics and the values we're trying to embody? And how can we do that together and figure that out with each other relationally? And I think that's what I'm hearing is I guess what I'm thinking about is anybody who's watching this, who's in therapy land or whatever we call this work, to think about those questions. What is at the heart of your work? What are the ethics and the values that you are trying to embody, with some critique of how we've been taught those, and with some critique around the individualistic kind of nature of how we've been taught those, and colonial and all of the things, violent ways we've been taught these. And how can I do that with community and connection to figure some of these pieces out? Because that's how I've experienced your way of kind of approach and work. That to me, that is part of, and that's where we can think about what would activism look like.
Yeah.
In the work of it. We have to be able to deconstruct some of these pieces and understand what is at the root and what grounds you. What is your foundation that you're working from? So you did absolutely answer that question. I was just like asking the question half baked, but I think, yeah, I guess I'm sitting with that and hoping that folks will think about those questions and really think hard about what does that look like.
Yeah, and think hard together. Like reminding ourselves, right, that like it's social learning theory. That's what Paulo Freire and the popular education movement's about. Nobody has a good idea on their own. Like collectively, hold ourselves collectively and rethink some things and imagine. Howard Zinn says we're in a crisis of imagination. And how can we imagine collectively worlds worth living in, right? As Ignacio Martin Beret would say, those worlds are already present. The futures that are actually already present in these ways we are in being with each other. And I think the thing also for me is to have some intention about this. Having been in solidarity groups with me, like when I'm trying to build a group, I do not like this group idea of forming, storming, and norming. I've had people come to me in universities when I'm a prof they feel they could talk to about something, probably the queer community. I'm straight, but I'm the best thing people had at one time is holy hell, truly. Yeah, I've had students just knock their head on their desk when I came out as heterosexual and said, I just wanted one queer professor. And I'm like, yeah, I'm straight and I have tattoos. I'm as radical as this faculty gets. What the hell is wrong with us? But anyway, I had queer students come to me that homophobia happened in a group counseling course. And the prof did nothing. And so I tried to, and then I ended up having a conversation with the prof and they told me this. They said, Vikki, groups need to form and norm, and then they storm and then they norm. This is how group process works. And I was like, okay, so what we're going to norm with is homophobia. And they were like, oh, you're so judgmental. You are so abdicating your power. You're pretending you have no power in this group, right? For me, I take it very seriously that it's my job to create an ethical container that has revolutionary love and solidarity and the collective ethics that we share. So some of the questions I ask people is, what is in your heart? What is sacred to you? What do we need to know about you to make space for you to not transgress against you? That is a vulnerable, relational, heart-based question. And that's what I want to do in groups. I ask those kind of questions. And I think the trauma industry talks about how you need to create safety to have vulnerability. But the reality is people come together through collective ethics and revolutionary love. That's palpable. That love is palpable with each other. And then people actually take risks and show what's in their heart. They're vulnerable. And that's how you structure safety. And we know that from activism. Like what I think about is when I'm on the homelessness march, this is an example I've used before, but a couple of years ago on the homelessness march, the bicycle police were there and everybody's, oh, the bicycle police, they're outdoorsy and kinder. Don't fool yourselves. They're trained to use those bicycles as weapons. So when they're, in the rich part of town, it's all flowers and rabbits being in a park. But when they're in the downtown east side, the poorest part of Canada, outside of First Nations Reserve, and homelessness people are marching, and there's spontaneous marches sometimes. A building has been closed or someone's been murdered, and there's a spontaneous, and I would join that anytime I'm around to try to add my sheltered body because I'm a renter, but I have shelter. I join that march. It's instantaneous, right? I don't know the names of every person there, but I have a revolutionary love for them. I know as soon as the bike police come, and they will, they're going to try to kettle. That's what they call it. It's a tactic they learn. They're going to try to kettle a homeless person. They're not going to go after Abby or Bhupie or Vikki. They're going to go after the homeless person, and they try to kettle them and take them out and criminalize them and arrest them for whatever, jaywalking or whatever kind of thing. I know everybody in that little gathering is going to throw their bodies between that bicycle police officer and that homeless person. That is love. That's revolutionary love. You can do this. We do this instantaneously. I guess what you're saying, this is pre-existing all the time, right? In this revolutionary love, right? Which is a solidarity with others and commitment to their cause. I'm thinking about communities of struggle, targeted communities that are actively marginalized, not marginal communities, but communities that we've put in, the majority of people being put in margins. And just thinking about how this mutual aid, we have such rich histories of mutual aid. And can't the stuff that gets called psychotherapy be a piece of that? So for me, in these movements like that I'm telling you about, like the Chileans have had such a massive impact on me. They brought the Chilean refugees who came after the coup the American-backed coup in Chile of the first democratically elected socialist. They murdered him and had this huge coup. A lot of people, tens of thousands of activists were tortured and murdered, and many people escaped, and they walked all the way across the United States and came into Canada, into Vancouver. The Vancouver social movements we owe so much to the Chilean community who brought a radical analysis in the 70s. And they were already, one of the things they were resisting in Chile was colonization of Mapuche people and other indigenous people. I learned about that stuff from Chileans, not reading. But when I was meeting with these Chileans, some of the people who were my clients, who were survivors of torture, they were psychotherapists. And they had been meeting with activists in coffee shops and in informal spaces and running informal groups, anything that couldn't look like it was psychotherapy, because that would they could target and find out who the people who are revolutionaries and activists that you're seeing. They just did all this guerrilla therapy. And that inspired me to do more solidarity work, which I've always done, which is I do a lot of things I don't consider therapy at all. And it's not actually witnessing. Some of what I'm doing, is just solidarity work with activists. But I learned that on the backs of Argentinian therapists and Chilean therapists who have always been doing this. So there's threads of liberatory psychology and people resisting the capitalism and individualism of psychotherapy we also have those histories. In psychotherapy, I want to honor, I'm not pretending that I'm doing anything that's carries any of those same kind of risks. But like meeting in a cafe with a person who's a revolutionary who is at risk of being tortured, and you're trying to help them stay alive in the work, that is revolutionary struggle, right? And doesn't psychology have a place in the struggle? That's it. This is what Ignacio Martin-Baró was talking about as well. What would it be like if psychology was actually oriented to social transformation and justice? Mm-hmm. And not only why can't it be, it already is. He keeps saying there already are practitioners doing these things, right? And I just find that amplifies possibility. And it made from my own lack of imagination, it made it imaginable that kind of work was possible as well. outside of capitalism and outside of paid work, but it made me feel it was the best use of me in certain times. It has been across time.
I'm just curious also, unless Abby, did you have something to say?
No, not really. I'm just sitting with the hopefulness of that last piece of that reframe that's landing with me
Oh,
in a certain way. I don't know how to describe the sensations yet, but I think I've always come to this thinking that psychotherapy, it's my own binary thinking of, oh, I'm complicit in the system that's like part of the medical industrial complex and it's so terrible. We have to like
yeah.
resist it from the inside. And then there's always a part of me that's feeling guilty for being part of it. But
Yeah.
then in hearing that reframe, I'm like, oh, wait, hold on. So it's that saying of everything is a tool if you hold it right, or everything's a weapon if you hold it right. There's imaginative hope that's coming up, that's landing with that reframe that I'm just sitting with right now. Yeah, very cool.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think about all these amazing therapists who are doing these amazing things, like the Chileans I'm connected with, Pranas Narrative Therapy. I went down during a massive unrest in Chile when they overthrew their government and they were rewriting their constitution. I was there and there were many manifestations, and I was meeting with hundreds of community workers in the name of teaching therapy. And Carlos and Italo, who are Pranas from Chile, we went out to manifestations together. I was really involved in movements. And if you were sitting in that space, none of this would be a new thought. Everybody, these are hundreds of community workers and therapists who came to therapy as social transformation. That's how they came. They didn't sneak it in like I did and try to do it later and put your head down and get your PhD so you can do something else. This is why they came. And so and it just makes you excited, doesn't it? To think, where are all these spaces? How do we be in more solidarity with each other in these spaces? And I've been and oh man. Yeah, I always it's reciprocal, it's relationships. It's these relationships of solidarity. And I love those two people. I love those people. I love what they're doing. Um, yeah, I just think there's been these connections of love for me. Solidarity is always tied with revolutionary love. And my father, Bill Reynolds, was an Irish Catholic man, born in Toronto, but he taught me about revolutionary love. He would never use the language of revolutionary love, but about like an ethic of belonging and collecting people who are lost souls and holding people together and refusing to abandon people. I think there's a lot in all of our cultures from this. And that for me is mental wellness. That's how I knew my dad was mentally well. He collected lost people and took care of them. That's that kind of love. And my mother showed up with food for everybody. She fed all those people, that we collected and loved them. So I just think about how much of this, like, where is this going on, Abby, that's being disguised or hidden for all kinds of reasons because of the political judgment and the carceral logics of psychotherapy, like the crime and punishment, thinking about you better not have bad boundaries. And it's like, who gets accused of having bad boundaries? Yeah, Indigenous people from communities of struggle who are already in these networked relationships, which is how you structure safety, right? And all of this is the doing of love. I've really appreciated reflecting on love and the role of love in my work and how when we can say justice doing, but we mean love. And I made a commitment early on because, like I said, love was never spoken in my formal education of 27 years. I made an early commitment that I was going to talk about love every time I spoke. And it's easier now, but man, did I ever get like walls and backlash and people like, you better explain that. You're not talking about having sex with clients, are you? I was like, so, it's interesting. That's just trying to have a liberatory practice that puts words to actual deeds, as Alan Wade would say. I think some of what we're doing is love. I don't think everything psychology is doing is love. And I don't think everything I do is activism, but there are those moments, and they string those together. That's, I think, where possibility lies. Mm.
I think that really speaks to the process of how we can hold each other through this work that we're doing as well, and to build those relationships. There was something you said earlier that I've already lost and forgotten. My apologies, but that reminded of how do we hold each other in that messiness? One thing that I've experienced in being in relationship with both you and Bhupie is that when I am wading through these things in my own with mistakes and the way that I'm saying things is not necessarily articulated in a certain way, there's always this held sense of, okay, we'll work through it together and we'll come through it. And something that you said just makes me think about how we can collectively hold each other in this work and then find a way through rather than looking for this is the way we do social justice practice. And this is what question you ask in therapy. And this is how you do witnessing and XYZ, but maybe more holistically, how we be in community with each other as we figure this out.
Yeah, for me as well, it's coming full circle in that sense of, Vikki, you started out talking about the erasure of this wisdom that's existed for such a long time. And then I think the response to it is to be in community and connection and not to forget it, to have these conversations and to really resist that idea of one answer fits all. But what are you doing? What are you figuring out? This is what I'm having. What can we do together also? And in connection with each other. And also one of the things I think one of the tactics psychology uses is if you're trying to step away from doing what you've been told to do because you're moving towards more care and love, there's so much fear of surveillance and consequences and carcerality. And I'm not saying that's not real in some ways, but I think when you're in connection and community, it makes it more okay to be able to stretch and to be able to enact your values and ethics and the ethics that we technically sign up for, right? And I think that the community piece is so important in so many different levels. So I'm feeling like I'm landing into that even more after this conversation, and then sitting with that same piece that Abby, you're talking about, that the possibilities feel more and feel, yeah. I'm just thinking about the little ways of what this looks like. Again, having this conversation, reminding me of other kind of moments or things that I have done or other people have done or talked about, or yeah. So thank you for this, Vikki, really.
Oh, thanks for that. I guess what I'm hearing you say and how I would respond is just don't do this alone. It's solidarity. Do things in solidarity. And there's always more solidarity but look for solidarity, because as the way to do this is the more people who are doing this and people with different locations of power, like the two of you running these trainings and me having a PhD, when we do these things overtly and publish about these things and say these things, it does make some more space. And those spaces have primarily, for me, been opened up by survivors of torture, people who have been oppressed, who've taught me these things on their back and really benefited my work. And just part of my solidarity is accountability, not guilt. Just like if we're going to be involved in this project that's called psychology, let's make sure it's a transformational space in society. Thanks so much for having me here. I've really appreciated this.
Yeah, I was just wondering, was there anything else that you wanted to share before we wrap up? But this has just been like feeling and landing in a really nice place right now.
I just think it's really sweet to create connections between social justice activism and love. It is love. It's love with legs. That's what it looks like in action. And how these are seen as like different. Yeah. And how do we seriously, anybody who's talking about doing truly relational work, if you're creating a relationship, you are doing love in some way. Yeah. Thanks again for having me. I'm really honored to be with this crew of amazing humans that you brought together doing this. And I'm well aware, I think I'm I might be the only person with white skin privilege or the way. And that's, I'm just really moved that you would include me, and I'm really humbled by that. And it makes a lot of sense.
And I think the other thing is that I would also want to make public is you have been part of, I think, Abby, both of our solidarity teams for quite some time and have informed the work that we do. And it made sense to bring you on board to not only speak to that, but to also speak to, I know you've always wanted to kind of decenter yourself and really speak about where this work is coming from.
Yeah.
And I've witnessed you do that we've known each other, I think, for almost a decade and a half now, which is wild. But I've witnessed you do that and resist that in so many ways. And so I think our invitation was knowing that you weren't going to center yourself as, look at me, I'm the expert here as a white person with Prospect that's trying to work with BIPOC in particular, and that you would come back to the lineages of where some of this stuff comes from. And yeah.
And then genuinely, our relationship, really, there is lateral mentoring here. Like that, I'm not, I mean that very genuinely, right? Yeah. I think that's what connects us. For me, that's what keeps me in that kind of lateral mentoring, and big respect for all of that.